Why, oh, why is there something rather than nothing? Why, oh, why is there something rather than nothing? Hello, everyone. My name is Persohn. You can contact me with my email address, which is pastor@mascot.church, or in the comments below if you like. If you like this video, you share it, subscribe to the channel, whatever. YouTube might recommend it to somebody else, but I'm not really sure how that's working these days. Now, this is a topic that I share about once or twice a year in my congregation, usually on a special fellowship meal Sunday, but I didn't get a chance this year. And this is leading into Advent studies, and so it's kind of a good kind of basis, a bit of a starting point for us. It's also an important thing to remind people of. It's worthwhile, my friends, having a few points, a few arguments, if you will, not in a debate argument, but I think you know what I'm talking about, using that broader, more liberal sense of the word argument. Arguments for the existence of God, just in your head, just so that you know, kind of memorize, kind of ready to use. Why is that important? There are a lot of reasons why this is a good thing to do. In the workplace, occasionally you'll get people who might taunt you for your beliefs or tease you or whatever. I've had that happen. And a couple of times I've said this, I'd love to sit down, buy you a coffee, and share with you some of the one of the classical arguments for the existence of God for you to think about. I've very rarely ever had anybody take me up on it. But what has happened, once I use that approach, almost everyone starts treating me a little bit better. That's just really, really interesting. It's because, you see, most people aren't aware that there are arguments for the existence of God, and they really don't want their position challenged. And we're in the process of trying to make as much peace as we can, in the workplace and in the world. It's also good to have arguments like this handy to teach your children, because your children get faced with the most inane points about faith and God and religion and so on that they're just supposed to accept without any sort of basis. So if I was doing my whole ministry time again, this would be a much bigger element in the teaching of children for sure. So anyways, we're going to have a look now at my points, the points that I keep handy, and some interesting things that I've added to this later on. So what I'll do is my image is going to be in the bottom of the screen here, so you have to flick back and forth between my mug and the text. Let's go through my points here. These are based on Leibniz's question, which is why then oh why, or is there something rather than nothing? And this is how I personally like to handle that. I think that it's worthwhile putting together your own view on this, your own idea. If I remember, I'll put all my points below in the conversation, so you can, in the comments, so you can grab them and have a look later on. So let's get this organized here and put my image down here and flick over to the PowerPoint, and here we go. So we start with this notion or this question or this statement, it's more than a notion, from Latin ex nihilo nihil fit, which means from nothing, nothing comes. And we're going to dig a little bit at this word nothing in this presentation today. So this is kind of the foundation. We ask ourselves if anything can come from nothing. And so I don't think anything can come from nothing, but we'll follow along here and see. So we start with this one. I start with this one, but I don't always. In these conversations, I don't often pick up these linearly. You have all of these points can stand alone quite nicely. But let's start with this here. I'm going to hold up my coffee cup as an example. There was a time when any particular thing was not. In that case, something other than that particular thing caused it to be. So let's come back to my coffee cup. And I need a sip, by the way. Very nice. A bit warm outside, but still nice to have a bit of hot coffee. So there was a time when the cup was not. There was a time when these things were not. In that case, something other than these things caused it to be. I don't really have a problem with that, and nobody I've ever met has a problem with that. All effects, things, or actions have causes. All causes precede their events. What's that mean? Well, if I drink all of the coffee, there's a cause there. The cause preceded the event. So if there's an explosion, there was a cause for the explosion that came before. Now in electronics and technology, we're now in the measuring of fractions of a picosecond, fractions of a trillionth of a second. But we can still see that causes come before the effects. So that's important to understand and to hold in our head while we tick along with this conversation here. So the next logical point that I would come up with is something like this. Nothing can be self-caused, can it? Let's read the whole thing first. Nothing can be self-caused, or it would bring itself into being. And I would rejoin that even an omnipotent being cannot cause itself to be. So think very carefully about this one. Don't let this one trip you up. There's a lot going on here. Nothing can be self-caused. So if a thing could be self-caused, it would have to bring itself into being. Even an omnipotent being could not cause itself to be, because that would mean that this being would have to have ability and knowledge and sense and capability before it would ever turn up. So if this bottle were caused by itself, it would mean that something in the bottle would, and then that, you got it. You've got it right now. Okay, so this is a very good point. People don't often think to this level when they look at these wonderful topics. So let's push this a little bit farther here. An existing thing, can I just have another sip of coffee, please? An existing thing cannot have a non-existing thing as its cause. In other words, nothing can have nothing as a cause. Now we're going to dig into this word nothing that's coming up here. That's kind of the way we're framing this presentation today. But let's look at this point here. An existing thing. So do you exist? Does my coffee cup exist? To the best of my senses and my ability, it does exist. Maybe we are all living in some kind of matrix, but then our thoughts and perception exist. So who knows, okay? But let's do this again. An existing thing cannot have a non-existing thing as its cause. In other words, nothing can have nothing as a cause. Everything that exists had to have something that caused it that existed. Again, there's a lot to this statement. It really, really is a lot heavier than it sounds. We're not just doing word salad here. That's right. If a thing exists, it couldn't have something that didn't exist as its source. It just doesn't work. Okay, so we're kind of digging, we're kind of stepping back here. We're just stepping back. Now we come to then another point that is useful. Sometimes I'll even start my conversations with this one. All things are dependent on something else. So let's take an elemental component like iron, for example, just as an element, or oxygen, anything in the periodic table. Those things seem pretty durable, but given enough heat or enough of a kind of a nuclear explosion or whatever, those things can be modified and changed as well. So they depend on a reasonably stable environment in which to survive. Now, of course, they can handle huge variations in pressure and in temperature and in time and so on, huge variations. But it seems that we understand now they can all be in the right condition, broken down, torn apart. So even they depend on something else. Now my coffee cup here, it is very dependent. It is very dependent on me not dropping it. It's very dependent on how much heat. I mean, it can take a lot more heat than the human body, but you heat it up enough, it'll melt, it'll break down. It's dependent on not being percussed with a hammer. It's quite dependent. Myself as a human being, you as a human being, are profoundly dependent on other things. My coffee cup can live in a vast amount of temperature. It can live in outer space or deep in the ocean. It doesn't live, but it can survive. You can't. You have to have a very, very narrow amount of temperature, a range, very narrow pressure, very narrow amount of humidity, of moisture, very narrow amount of cosmic radiation, really just of all of the minerals and all of the things that are out there that are consumed, the things you consume have to be produced in a very particular way that you can digest them. You can't eat rocks. You ever notice you can't eat fire, right? By the time you get food, even the simplest of food, it is got to be super, I guess, changed or enhanced from its natural elements. Of course, there are some natural things you can consume. Water is one of those things, and air is another. You can consume those things, but there are other things you can't. Fluorine, molten lead, they're fluids. What's the matter? Magma? No, you can't, right? So you're very dependent. And you're very dependent in other areas. You're dependent on the correct emotional environment. You're dependent on things like love and things like affection. You might not think that you are, but look on the inside and find out how those things formed you. We are completely dependent. So don't think you can survive without being dependent on something else. So now, of course, we put all these points together and we're going to start going back in time and finding this that came from this, that came from this, that came from this, that came from this, that. And you find out what's going on. Let's look at my next point here. If you go back far enough, you would end with nothing. No thing. All right. Now this is where we're going to, this is where bad English. At this point, we need to start paying a bit of attention to the nothing conversation. When I say nothing in the context of this topic here, I mean nothing. No heat, no light, no electricity, no energy, no time, nothing, no thing at all. Okay. Now there is I guess it's a worldview where there's an atheistic position that says, well, things that exist today pop out of the quantum field. They just come into existence, and there's some evidence that particles may come in and out of the quantum field. Well, so they would say, yes, something can come from nothing. I would say respectfully, no, the quantum field, even if that's the case, the quantum field is not nothing. It is something. It's a quantum backdrop of energy, and it is subject to time. It's subject to change. So no, that's not the definition of nothing that we're using. We're using a definition of nothing that is no time, no space, no black, no white, not space, nothing. Right? And that's much different than a quantum field kind of background, or, the whole universe was filled with atoms and various elements, and something happened, they began to whatever, or there was a big bang or whatever. No, we're taking a step back. We're talking about something coming from nothing, and that's how this conversation works. Now, this is a really perfect example of something we see all the time in conversations with people who think differently than us. And you frame it this way. They may share your vocabulary, but they don't necessarily share your dictionary. In other words, we both use the word nothing, but the word nothing in terms of the existence of all things has a different meaning for me, as I've hoped to try to communicate with you, than it does for the guy who is holding to the quantum field. They say, well, the quantum field is nothing, right? So that's the point. And we're seeing this in modern conversations today. Words we have grown up with for many years, we might use the same word, but they mean completely different things to us. And you can pick them out of what's happening in our society. Words like woman, man, even capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, all of those words might mean different things to different speakers, and maybe from different historical backgrounds. And so it's important when you're having a discussion to say, what are the words that we're using, and let's define them. Sometimes that takes longer than actually getting to a discussion, actually getting to a point, and that's really, really important to understand. And here is a particular example of that. When we say nothing, we mean something different then. I don't have to repeat that because you're a pretty smart audience. So our next step here is that there's only one way around this. There must be something that exists that does not depend on anything. Okay? They're really, in my mind now, maybe in your mind, that's not a requirement. In your mind, maybe you could keep on going back infinitely, but there are problems with the infinite argument as well, serious problems with that. We won't talk about that today, but really bad problems. You could, infinite regression, maybe, but in my mind, the only way around this is that there must be something that exists that does not depend on anything. Well, we would push this one step farther, and remember, we're talking about the existence of God here. This we call the necessary being, that which cannot fail to exist. Now, I'm not diminishing any element of the deity of God when I call him a necessary being. I've used that that must be something here. I'm being a bit careful, but by calling God the necessary being is probably or equal to calling him eternal and utterly holy and perfect and pure in every way. He cannot fail to exist. And some of the early theologians used the word ineffable, that God was ineffable. You can't explain, he's beyond the ability to be explained, right? Sometimes so great, you can only really explain him in the negative, typically that immortal, that is not mortal, and so on. Omnipresent, right? You take one word and you add another to another variation of it to try to get to God. It's called the via negativa, other topic altogether. But this is where this conversation takes us all the way to the back. Now, let's say that that God, remember the earlier element that I talked about, that everything is dependent on something else. Well, in this case, the necessary being would not be dependent on anything in the created order. Let's assume that God created time and then made himself dependent on it. Let's assume, now I believe that it's correct to say that God created time. Time is the thing that undergirds all the changes that take place, and God does not change. So let's assume that God created time. Let's take that as written from how we understand the scriptures. And then God made himself subject to time. Oh, you see, this is akin to an object cannot create itself. Self-creation. You see, this would make him dependent on something in the created order. Let me assure you, God is not dependent on anything in the created order. So this is a really fascinating way to look at and understand this whole issue. And so here's my points. Let's flick through them really, really quickly as I close this. And I really encourage you to put together your own discussion and your own points just to help those around you. And by the way, this study can help you in yourself appreciate the greatness and the wonder of things eternal. It's certainly done that for me. So the first point, really quickly here, from nothing, nothing comes. Secondly, there was a time when any particular thing was not. In that case, something other than that particular thing caused it to be. My third slide, all effects of things or actions have causes. All causes precede their effects. Just think so deeply. Each one of these will keep you up at night, which is fascinating. Here we go. Nothing can be self-caused, or it would bring itself into being. Even an omnipotent being cannot cause itself to be. Wow. An existing thing cannot have a non-existing thing as its cause. In other words, nothing can have nothing as its cause. Or let's try this. No thing can have nothing as a cause. Interesting, isn't it? All things are dependent on something else. Now I'm going to qualify that slightly and say all things in the created order, but I think you know where I'm going here. Dependent, contingents-wise. Sometimes this is called the contingency argument. If you go back far enough, you'd end with nothing. Not a quantum field. No thing, no time, no space, no black, no white, no up, no down, nothing, no vacuum, nothing, no thing, no created order at all. There's only one way around this that is in my mind, and I think in the mind of many. There must be something that exists that does not depend on anything. This is probably the most important statement of the whole bunch here. There must be something that exists that does not depend on anything. The whole argument is undergirded by this comment that's right on the screen that you're seeing here. This we call the necessary being, that which cannot fail to exist. Or maybe I should say, rather than that which cannot fail to exist, he who cannot fail to exist. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is that conversation. Let me just get myself organized here. And, I know what I've done. And so today we've dealt with why is there something rather than nothing? This is Al's approach on this one, and I hope you enjoyed it. God bless you. Come back for more soon.